All right. So looking at functional classification of neurons. Functionally, if we look at neurons, there are three types. We have sensory neurons, and the sensory neurons carry information towards the central nervous system. So these are sensory neurons. Then we have motor neurons. Motor neurons, they carry the outgoing command from the CNS to the effector. In here, the blue neuron that originates from the spinal cord. So this thing is a spinal cord. The blue neuron that carries the output is called a motor neuron, and in this case it's carrying it to the skeletal muscle. So one more time. Sensory neuron, the orange neuron, that is a sensory one, and it's carrying the input towards the central nervous system. Look at the red arrow. So information is going towards the central nervous system via the sensory neuron in orange. Okay. All right, another thing that I would like to show you here, look at the cell body of this sensory neuron. See, this is the cell body of the sensory neuron, and this structure is a unipolar neuron. More to be discussed in spinal cord. But the cell body of this neuron is actually outside the central nervous system. Do you see that? It's outside the spinal cord. And the cell body of this neuron lies in this swollen structure called posterior root ganglion. So, how did we define a ganglion? A ganglion is defined as a group of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. So here we see we are only looking at one, but there are many cell bodies here. So group of cell bodies outside the central nervous system is called a ganglion, and in this case we are looking at posterior root ganglion. Is that making sense to you? Okay, so ganglion, group of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. We are looking outside the spinal cord here. All right, we did talk about the motor neuron, and moving on to interneuron. Interneurons, they lie in between the sensory and motor neurons, and they are the decision makers. And if I go back to this diagram, so we see the sensory neuron in orange, and the sensory neuron is communicating to a purple interneuron. Do you see that? The interneuron lies within the spinal cord. It is 100% contained within the spinal cord. And the interneuron, I compare the interneuron as parent. So if you are a parent, and let's say you have two kids, and they are fighting, right? They're fighting with each other. And what do you do as a parent? They come to you, they complain, and you are the decision maker, right? You decide, and you tell your elder one to behave maybe, and you separate out the younger one. The younger one probably gets timeout or something, right? So you are deciding what action to take when your two kids are not behaving or they are fighting like crazy. Okay, so those are the interneurons, those are the parents. They receive the sensory information via the sensory neurons. They decide what action to take, and then they send the command to the motor neurons. They tell the motor neurons, go and tell the skeletal muscle to contract. So the motor command travels via the motor neuron to the skeletal muscle. Okay. Now, another thing. The interneuron, if you look at the interneuron and the motor neuron, they look like this. Right? This is called multipolar. Structurally, this is multipolar neuron. And if you remember the sensory neuron, it looked like this. This is called unipolar. Okay, so remember one thing, you might be tested on this on your exam. Sensory neurons are unipolar structurally. So functionally they are sensory because they're carrying sensory information, and structurally they're unipolar. Multipolar neurons look like this. So functionally these are interneurons. These are interneurons and motor neurons. Functionally, these are interneurons and motor neurons, and structurally, they are multipolar. Okay. Okay, so interneurons are multipolar and they are 100% within the central nervous system. And one thing, about 99% of our total neurons, they are interneurons. So we have lots and lots and lots of interneurons. Okay, now let's take a look here. Actually, class, I drew out a picture right here. Okay, let's do this together. So we see a sad man. Okay, the person is very, very sad. He's crying. Why is he crying? Because he has a bad insect bite, shown by the orange dot. So he has insect bite. He's obviously in a lot of pain. And on the right hand side, we see an enlarged area, an enlarged cross-sectional area of his spinal cord. Okay, so we will try to identify the different neurons and also their structure and function. Okay, so let's focus on the area of insect bite on the body of the person, shown by the orange dot. So that area of his body obviously has some receptors that lead to sensory neuron, right? So the purple neuron is a sensory neuron. Do you agree? That's a sensory neuron because it's carrying information towards the spinal cord. Okay, so that's the function of the neuron. It carries sensory information from the receptors towards the central nervous system. Good. All right. Then structurally, this neuron is a unipolar neuron. So structurally, this is a unipolar neuron. And if you see the cell body of this neuron, which is right here, the cell body of the neuron is outside the central nervous system. So the cell body lies within the dorsal root ganglion. And we know what is a ganglion. It's a group of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Okay, so the sensory neuron carries sensory information towards the spinal cord. The interneuron shown in blue, that's an interneuron. It receives the sensory information and it decides what action to take. Remember, interneurons are the parents. They decide what action to take. Interneurons, they are multipolar. Structurally, they are multipolar. The structure, I didn't draw the dendrites though. So they look like this. So that's multipolar neuron. So they decide what action to take and then they talk to the motor neuron in gray here. So the gray one is a motor neuron. The motor neuron, it carries the command to the effector, in this case the skeletal muscles here. Okay, so the motor neuron is also multipolar structurally, so it's multipolar. Okay, and it carries outgoing information, also known as efferent pathway, and this would be the afferent pathway. Okay, one more thing. So cell bodies, please hear me. Cell bodies of sensory neurons in purple. Cell body of sensory neuron is outside the central nervous system in dorsal root ganglion. The entire interneuron in light blue is contained within the central nervous system. If you look at the motor neuron in gray, the cell body lies within the spinal cord, but the axons come out via spinal nerve. Good? Okay. So let's look here. So here we do see a woman and her neck and shoulder region. There are receptors there. The receptors, via the receptors, sensory information come to the spinal cord, and the incoming or the input pathway is called the afferent pathway, and that is conducted by sensory neuron. Structurally, this sensory neuron is unipolar in nature. The sensory neuron talks to an interneuron, which is 100% within the spinal cord. Structurally, the interneuron is a multipolar neuron, as we see here. The interneuron decides what action to take, and then it coordinates with a motor neuron in blue. The motor neuron is structurally a multipolar neuron, and the motor neuron carries the output command or carries the efferent. It forms the efferent pathway, and ultimately it innervates skeletal muscle and tells the skeletal muscle to contract. The cell bodies of the motor neurons lie within the central nervous system, as we see here. All right. And the cell bodies of the sensory neuron lie within the ganglion. These are the interneurons and the cell bodies of the motor neurons. All right, so we are done with the neurons. Let's move on to the glial cells. Now, glial cells, they are way smaller than the neurons, and there are very many glial cells. There are many glial cells. However, we do not have so many neurons, so they outnumber the neurons. Glial cells are also known as neuroglia, and glial cells are found both in the CNS and PNS, so they are part of the central nervous system and also peripheral nervous system. And then a few other things. They are smaller, obviously. They can divide mitotically, and they cannot be excited. Neurons, they can be excited. They can carry electrical impulse in the form of action potential. Glial cells don't do that. They usually nurture and nourish the neurons. That's a function of the glial cells. Okay. So let's say you are a healthcare professional working in a hospital and you have a patient with brain tumor. So what type of cells will you find in the tumor? Will it be neurons or glial cells? Think. If you say it's going to be glial cells, the tumor is made up of glial cells, you are correct, because glial cells are capable of mitosis and giving rise to the tumor. Neurons cannot divide mitotically, so neurons cannot give rise to a tumor, to a brain tumor. Okay. So we did talk about these. So they protect and nourish the neurons. So they are the babysitters for the neuron. They are not excitable. There are way more glial cells than neurons. And we also talked about the brain tumor. Now, there are glial cells of the CNS and then glial cells of the PNS. How do we remember? If you think of the CNS, the glial cells are AEMO. AMO. Can you remember AMO? AMO are the glial cells of the CNS, or the brain and spinal cord. So spinal cord and brain will have these four glial cells, AMO. A stands for astrocyte, ependymal cells, then M stands for microglial cells, and O stands for oligodendrocyte. I'll start with a new video explaining the functions of these cells.